My name is Imelda McCarthy, and I live in Dublin in Ireland and have been a family systemic therapist for many, many years, almost 50. I have been a teacher, supervisor, mentor, writer, and an academic in my career. And I'm very privileged to have been invited to be a guest conversationalist in the Systemic Lives series on murmurations.
If you have any suggestions for people you'd like to hear from, please do reach out to us at systemiclives.com. Look forward to hearing from you.
Today I'll be talking with Arlene Healey, who set up Northern Ireland's first family trauma centre in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement here, which ended the war in Northern Ireland in 1998. I know that you're going to find Arlene's words and her story inspirational. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you, and thank you for agreeing to join this conversation, which I've been invited to do by Murmurations as a guest conversationalist on Systemic Lives podcast. And I know that the team in Murmurations had a view that these podcasts would be used to honour people who made significant contributions in our field. And for me, you're one of those people. And you're a very humble, low-key person. And I know that this would not be one of your favourite things to be doing. And so thank you for allowing me to persuade you to do it, to twist your arm to do it, and to be here with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Melda.
It's a privilege, Arlene. But to set the context for those who'll be watching this podcast, I just want to outline the context in which you've worked and in which what we're going to talk about today occurred. Because it was a very dramatic and significant context. And you talked about, and you said, the conflict in Northern Ireland has formed the backdrop to the whole of my adult life, from working in the city centre in my first job, age 20. There I got used to large bombs exploding. I knew the sound and I knew what to do. I knew what an AK-47 looked like and how to manage when stopped by the armed police and the armed soldiers. I then became a young social worker at the age of 21, or rather a trainee social worker. As a Protestant from East Belfast, I found myself working in West Belfast in largely Catholic and, I might add, IRA areas until I started the job. Until I started that job, I had met few people from the other community. I often found myself in extreme situations. I can remember on one occasion arranging for children to be removed from hostile, abusive parents, a routine social work task for many in the UK. However, in some parts of Belfast at that time, this required the support of the police. Again, not uncommon. However, they needed the army in full riot, military and war uniforms and a helicopter to provide cover for the army. The whole thing was a military operation planned in a fortified police station. I want that to sink in. At the time, we went about our business with an air of normality and said nothing. Meeting with other social workers from other parts of the UK, we remained silent. I'm sure we will come back to those themes of saying nothing and silence, which is kind of endemic on this island, as we continue our conversation. So as I said, you're deeply welcome, and I have admired your work for all of the 30 years that I've known you as a young Protestant woman from East Belfast, breaking barriers, moving across a segregated society to honour your mother's motto. Because I remember you telling me once that your mother said, be strong, love your children, and give them your best. And I know that applied not only to your own children and grandchildren, but also to all of the children of Northern Ireland. So perhaps you could give us some flavour of how a young woman because you were only 32 when you opened the Family Trauma Centre in Belfast. How come you discovered that bravery and strength in yourself to do what you did?
I'm thinking my sums are wrong, Imelda. I'm thinking it's a wee bit older than that. It was the family therapy training program, which was something I always wanted to do. And because we didn't have a family therapy training program in Belfast, I had to travel with a colleague every week down to Dublin. And on that journey, there was a rickety old train in that era. But lots of weeks the train wasn't running because the IRA had blown up the train line. You had to drive, they had to take a bus tour. It was very complicated. But also, when I would start talking about the work I was doing in Belfast, people looked at me almost with an air of disbelief about some of the work, like I was exaggerating or whatever. And then one night we had a group and I asked about it, and people said, we don't feel we have the right to ask Arlene because we don't know anything about the conflict. We don't feel we have the right to comment on it. But as time went on, working between those two cities, working in Dublin, working in Belfast, and nuances of the language was different, but the problems largely were systemic. But the backdrop of the conflict was not there. So it really made me think, but it is in Northern Ireland. And what do I do about it? Do I ask families about it? No, I don't. I ask about their difficulties. I don't ask about the conflict directly. So I felt that had to change. I felt I had to find a way to start asking. And the only way I could start asking was to ask families, have you been affected by the Troubles in any way? And then they would begin to say, well, yes, actually this happened, or no, thankfully we've managed to escape it. But when they started to tell their stories, I got scared at times because the stories were so frightening. And that helped me understand the silence, but it also made me determined to do something. Why were there no services? And I got involved in a project called the Cost of the Trouble Study. And it was a social policy led, because at that period of time, when I started to think about the conflict and the cost of it, there was no figures. We had not kept account of the numbers of people who died. No one knew. And the more I began to find out about it and got involved in the study, the Cost of the Trouble Study, the more I began to see the extent of the difficulties, the hundreds and thousands of bombs that had gone off. Today, there 3,700 odd murders happened, of which 3,000 remain unsolved today. And in Northern Ireland today, we have not dealt with the past. Only this morning, I was with a retiring police officer with his son, who has autism, who's got many struggles, but struggles that would be familiar to people. And he said, when I retire, I can't live here. I don't feel safe here. I have to move somewhere else. And he told me where he was moving to. And that's now. That's today. That's this morning.
Mm-hmm. And there's a silence about that on the island.
Yeah.
One gets a little glimpse of it in news items, because maybe it's seen it doesn't compare to some of the other conflicts around our globe at the moment. But on the other hand, it means a lot to people on this island. And the people, particularly in the north of the island, in the 6 counties in Ulster, all the names that we have for Northern Ireland, it's a daily lived reality. And it's also a daily class lived reality, because it affects probably the poorer population, the more marginalised populations more, which is my sense of it. But I don't know if that's true. Would you agree, Arlene?
Yes, but also the rural areas.
Okay.
In supervision recently, I was supervising someone who came from near the border areas, and those were very different, or from areas like Strabane. And it was somebody, I've known her as a colleague in camps for many years, but now in her retirement, she's doing some work with a voluntary group working with people affected by the Troubles. And it is troubling her so much and reminding her of all the things that happened within her family. And I've known this person 20 odd years. And I didn't know her uncle was killed, her cousin was killed, and the threats against the family. And so many of these stories. And when people talk about, say, Ukraine and think, how are people managing there? They get up in the morning, they feed their children, they get their groceries, they do the normal jobs, because you have to keep going. You have to do your normal stuff and put this other stuff aside and learn to live with the madness. And that's what we did, learn to live with the madness.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, or how much do you think do our colleagues in the UK or even in Europe know about Ireland and the war that went on in Ireland for over 20, 25 years? What's your sense of that as a therapist, moving around conferences and talking about trauma?
I remember the very first time I went to the Tavistock and I put my hand up to ask a question with a very Belfast accent, and people just kind of looked at me, and that sense of feeling different. And there's a lot in AFT at the moment about minority groupings and cultural groupings, and the Irish don't count. Do you know, the signs were up when I was born in England. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish. You feel that. You feel that kind of looked at or treated differently. Even in Heathrow Airport, the boarding gate for Belfast is the furthest most gate away. Or I'd have gone to Nottingham quite a few times, and it was a separate entrance. So people from Northern Ireland go into this entrance, everybody else goes in that one. And so you're used to your luggage being oversearched, being treated differently, being treated with suspicion. Very common. And you put up with it.
Yeah. And you know that you were talking about when you were born, and you were born in Nottingham, we should say, and the house that you were born in now houses the child court workers, which is extraordinary in terms of the spirit of your life. But when we started to visit England to give workshops, Nulling and myself and Phil, it would have been during the 80s, and those signs are still up. And it was actually quite dangerous for us traveling into England, and we weren't ever quite sure about how our accents were received. Now, I have to say, much later on, we were adopted and embraced, and our English colleagues were fantastic. But I still think to this day, I remember seeing a television program recently with David Putnam, who's become an Irish citizen. And he left the House of Lords. And he said that when he was in the House of Lords, when he tried to bring up Irish issues, his words, he said, my colleagues were pig ignorant about Ireland. And I just wondered what your sense of being out in the world was about that today. So you're saying it's pretty strong, and that we've kind of become invisible in a way.
On the one hand. On the other hand, I was speaking at a conference a month or so ago in Malta, a big children's conference. And the next day, two girls come up to me and said that they had Irish connections in they're American. And they sat up talking for 3 hours, and it was an evening presentation because they couldn't stop thinking about it. So that kind of lifts my heart that when I speak about Belfast, I speak about Northern Ireland, many people are interested, particularly in our field. They are interested. They do want to know more about it. But I do some work for Hostage International, and I was speaking to
International?
Hostage International.
Hostage, sorry.
It was set up to help and support families held hostage within family member held hostage internationally. And I was working with somebody recently. Her father had been kidnapped and murdered, and her son is having a lot of difficulties. So I was asked, would I speak with her? But there's also a consultant psychiatrist who lives in Scotland who was working with her as well now. And I was telling him that I had a colleague in England. He said, oh, yes, I know him. When I told Professor David Alexander about him, who's very well known in the field of trauma, who unfortunately has passed now, he said, remarkable to meet an Englishman that I like. And there is that dichotomy with English, not Scottish, not Welsh, but the Celtic nations are kind of different than the English. And even at school in Northern Ireland, you learned about the kings and queens of England. You learned about English history, you never learned anything about Irish history. And that sense of being second class or failures in terms of our government, in terms of our assembly. But then when things changed, it was outsiders who helped. It was Americans, it was the Clintons, it was people like that who showed that they cared and they were willing to talk to our politicians who are very difficult to talk to. From Ulster says no or whatever, they managed it somehow and brought about peace. And we still have peace. Fragile as it may be, we have peace.
Yes. But I want to talk about the change from the inside. So can you tell me the story? Because I know that it was very frightening for you at times doing this, of moving to set up the Family Trauma Centre. So it took a lot of courage. And you have said in the past that most of the support you got came from women. Yes. And most of the abuse you got and the attacks you got came from men, and particularly senior men, both in the civil service, in social work, and in the services generally, because here was a young woman, social worker, who was spearheading this very original, creative, and essential service in Northern Ireland at the time, and was doing it without any psychiatric supervision. Because your wonderful kind of claimed fame in my book is that you ran a service that wasn't medically supervised, which is kind of extraordinary. But I want to go back to those days. Can you tell the story of the people who supported you and how you actually got the Family Trauma Centre up and running? And I want you to tell the story about the building as well. But I'll ask you
I'd always had great support from Edith Nichol, who was the principal social worker in South Belfast. And she was a brilliant role model. And an aside, I do some work for the Historical Inquiries team about all the abuse that happened in children's homes in Northern Ireland. None that she managed. She went and had her dinner there during the week. That's how much she checked out what was going on. And I'm very proud of that. But I went and talked with her and our chief executive, who was male, and they had some faith, some hope in me, or saw some potential. And I said, we really do need a family trauma centre. We do need to bring together systemic psychotherapy theory and trauma theory and help families affected deeply by trauma. So off she went. And if you knew her, she's very immaculately dressed, and off she goes to get money, and often gets money, and had got me money for other side projects to do with voluntary work and what have you in the past. So off she went and managed to get some money. And in order to, it was like Easter holidays, I was told, go write a business case, do it now. So I did it over the Easter holidays, and I consulted with my other systemic colleagues who trained, Mary Kenny, Stephen Coulter. We met and got a bit of help and advice for them and did this very rough business case. And the next of it was a runner. And they had to get a building. And in order to get a building, they had to evict my manager from Wellington Park, which was a perfect building beside the university and a real neutral kind of area and very safe for families to come to. And it was a beautiful building. And I always had worked in South Belfast. But he was very displeased about that. And I'll just leave it there. But she gave me tremendous support. And after we Family Trauma Centre opened, there was a begging process. I mean, the other person who would have to take credit would be Mo Molam, because she said, I want a trauma centre and I want it now and no messing about. And the day before it opened, I mentioned to somebody who also was looking for that pot of money, and she created havoc, and it almost didn't open because somebody said, how does she know? How did this go back to the government that this was happening? And it was me blabbed it. But it opened anyway. And from the day and hour we opened and recruited wonderful people, really amazing people.
You did.
Who I trusted with my life. And we were a very happy team. But it was very difficult work. But I really wanted to make sure that nobody burnt out. And touch wood, no one did. And it was very hard work. But a pleasure, an absolute pleasure to work with these families. They were so grateful to have people to talk to. We took the service and outreach in different parts of Northern Ireland and negotiated places to set up shop. And so we were on the road and everybody did a bit. I did Derry, I did Newton Ards, other people did Oma, other people did Craigavon, other people did Newry.
I know that you did have this wonderful team, and I remember them very, very vividly and very well. And I remember that wonderful house. It was was it an Edwardian or Victorian?
Victorian.
Double-fronted house. It was amazing. But what amazed me was, and I think this is part of your downplaying of yourself, was how beautifully it was done up inside. It did not look like any other CAM service, psychiatric service, medical service, social service. It was done in beautifully muted but bright colours. It was warm, and you designed the whole thing from top to bottom. And I'm thinking, where did you get these skills from? You put in all the video suites, the two-way mirrors, the teams so that they could rotate backwards and forwards. You put in 2 waiting rooms to deal with the 2 communities who would come in, and so that families from the police wouldn't be meeting with IRA families, and family ex-British Army wouldn't be meeting with nationalist families, and so on and so forth. So you did everything to protect the people you were seeing. You also scheduled all the appointments so that there would be no difficult clashes in waiting rooms or hallways. And I'll go on to talk a little bit more about what you did with the clinical team structure and so on. But I've for years wondered, how did she get these skills and how was she allowed to do this? Because not only was she setting up this clinical setting that was new by this young woman, but she also was allowed to design the place, interiorly design the place and physically design the place. And then you told me this amazing story that when you worked at one stage with kids leaving care, that you remembered your mom's motto, which is to love the children. And you decided that these children leaving care at 18 needed to go to really nice dwellings.
Absolutely.
And there was a house that was used, and you got permission to do up this house. And so they knew about your interior design. So not only were you proposing a whole new family therapy, systemic therapy service, but you were also a designer, an interior designer. It was just incredible what you did.
Same person.
Was it the same person?
Same person.
Okay.
The same principal social worker who had strong views about sleeping care. Horrible dumps of flats that people were going into in that era. And you would take them around to look for someone for them to live. And they were horrible. You wouldn't have put your own children there.
Well, this is the thing. So, and you know, I think what you're saying here is such an inspiration to young and older workers that we don't have to live with the constraints of the systems that we find in ourselves. We can do something about it, but we have to find support. And I think you were very good at eking out that support in your own environment, in your own context. Because one of the things about you that I hold dear and admired was that you knew your context inside out. And that as a systemic therapist was extremely important to you, whether it was a social policy context, whether it was the NHS context, whether it was the Northern Ireland political context, whether it was the politics between East and West Belfast, between Protestants and Catholics, whatever it was, you made it your business to know those contexts. and then to look for collaboration and community building across them. So it's been one of your great gifts all along. So I just wanted to tell people a little bit about the house, because it was such a wonderful.
It was a one-off, and I knew it was a one-off slice of the pie, and you had to think of everything you needed right there and then. And previously, I had been project manager for an extension in the adolescent psychiatry unit, and I've done up houses and no fear about that. But they would send you the crappiest material and the crappiest curtains and broken stuff for contracts. And you had to go back and say, no, that's not good enough. I want this and I want that. So, I picked every chair. I sat on every chair. I picked blue and orange kind of colours, warm kind of colours, as you say. When I worked in the adolescent psychiatry team doing family therapy in the evenings, I used the reflecting team a lot. And you had to go from the viewing room into the therapy room via a wee narrow corridor. And one night in the wee narrow corridor, this child really cracked up, and the next of it, her arse went through the window. And so I learned from that to make the suite all inclusive. So the door was where the wall was, and you got the opportunity to knock down walls, to put doors in walls, to have 3 admin staff, because we're always short on admin staff. Now you go to the Family Trauma Centre today, and a lot of the things I put in place, like a full-time researcher, 3 admin, gradually cutbacks, it took away a lot of that stuff. Even during my time, took away the deputy post, took away stuff because we've had decades of austerity across the whole of the UK. But
I think we need to stop calling it austerity. I mean, okay. I think it's generally, not to you particularly, because that language took hold. But actually, it was a policy of neoliberal governments to take money from the poor to give it to the rich. And I think we should stop talking about austerity, because austerity is blindsiding us to what actually was going on, which was actually government policy. They had loads of money because they were giving it all to the wealthy. So yes, but in those days when we were robbing
a one-off chance, get everything you need right now and think about it. And brought the curtain samples home, consulted with my family, and did it up like I was doing up my house.
Yes, and it was so beautifully done, and you certainly did that.
And it was close to my heart. It was another baby.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you were also very influenced by what went on in the peace talks. And, as you said, it's difficult to talk to politicians in the North. It's difficult, because people can get into entrenched positions. And since we're in a period where everybody seems to be getting into entrenched positions, you developed this way of beginning to talk with families, which you call talks about talks, which was a metaphor from the peace talks. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about that in terms of your practice and developing the practice, and how you got into the very, very difficult conversations with very hurt people?
In order for the politicians to make progress, they had proximity talks about talks, gradually leading into talking about the very difficult reasons and the difficult politics. And that's what we needed to do with the families, because it was very, very hard to come and talk about murder, or to talk about kidnapping, or to talk about their partner having been involved in the conflict in some way. So talk with the families about, listen, we don't have to talk today about what actually happened. We can just talk about, for me, there were 4 stories. There was a very important story. Everything was okay in your life until X time. And that was an important story to hear. Everything in my family life was completely normal until the trauma happened. Then the next story was the awful thing that happened. And the next story was how it changed their lives. And the next story was the future, what way they wanted things to be for the future. And it's an old theory in family therapy, talking about past, present, future, weaving in between those things. And I always liked that idea. It's a circular diagram and kind of thinking of, but it also was like a rock that you could past, present, future. And I liked that idea. And allowed families to say, well, when you're ready to talk about the difficult stuff, we'll talk about that. In the meantime, tell me about how your life used to be. But also, mothers particularly would say, what can I do? I don't know what to do. Since our house was bombed, since my husband was murdered, since so-and-so was shot in the house. And they needed to be reminded that they could cook dinners. They could get school uniforms ready. They could do all the ordinary stuff that mums do, and reminded how valuable that was and how their children needed it. And how if you start with those things, other pieces will fall into place. And sometimes I like that Michael White idea of expert witnesses. And sometimes I did take the risk of putting two of the mothers in contact with each other who've been through the same experiences, that, for example, didn't believe that moving house would help. I was a mother in Derry, and she was politically connected, and a mother in County Down whose husband was in the prison service. Her house had been blown up. During the Eurovision Song Contest, I remember big about the Eurovision Song Contest, they blast bombed her house. And it was his own side who did it, which made it harder. And the process of him trying to be medically retired was very, very difficult. But it changed everything when they picked a house and they moved into it, and it was safe. And the family in Derry didn't want to sell their house because they thought that IRA supporters would take over the house, and they weren't prepared for that. And the child was having nightmares, bedwetting, very, very distressed. So I said, when you two women talk, you will know instantly who you are, and you will know what side of the fence you come from instantly, and your confidentiality is gone. Didn't care, spoke to each other, and the next of it, mother in Derry decided, this isn't worth it, I'm moving, and moved, and the child was fine thereafter and settled down. And somebody else in her family bought the family home, so it didn't go to strangers like she feared. And I'd done that a few times, and it was remarkable because thankfully I haven't been deeply affected by the conflict. I hadn't lost anybody. Nor had my home been attacked, and I live in a very quiet rural part of Northern Ireland. But because of the conflict, my sister in a mixed marriage lives in New Zealand, and he will never come back here. He will never live in Northern Ireland. Too hard. So I have lost that, and her children, and being connected to them, and all the rest of it. It's a small loss compared to many, but still a loss.
But the way in which the war and the troubles, as we euphemistically call it, impacted your life very deeply was your finding the courage and I don't know what it was, strength to do what you did in relation to that. Because in that small story that you told, I don't know if people would have got it, but I don't even know if I got it. You put people from the two different communities in contact with each other. That's what I understood. Is that right? Yes.
Absolutely.
And that was kind of an extraordinary thing to do, because you said in your young days that the communities didn't mix. So you never met people from the other community.
No.
And that's still the case. I mean, I was looking at a program about Northern Ireland the other day, and they were interviewing kids that really hadn't met kids from the other side. In other words, from nationalist Catholic communities. So that you were doing extraordinary things. And I think you talk about you were gently breaking the rules, but I think the rules you were breaking were kind of extraordinary, because they were what Alan Wade calls those small acts of living that you were talking to the mums about, yes, you do, you cook the meals, you look after your children, you do the everyday tasks. They're the small acts of living that kind of resist the awful effects of trauma and the awful effects of conflict or the awful effects of violence. And you were doing that, I think, in your work, and you were also doing it in the fact in how you set up the teams to work with the families who came in. Because what you did following, I think the New Zealanders were your inspiration, the Just Therapy team of Charles Waldegrave and Kiwi Tomasese and the rest of that wonderful team. Is that you had people from the different cultural backgrounds on your staff, and that they were on all the teams that saw the clients that came in. So you were using a team-based approach, but culturally diverse team-based approach in a time before a lot of us were talking about that in the field. Can you say a little bit about that and the influences that allowed that to happen for you?
In becoming passionate about family trauma, in that era, systemic field was over here and the field of trauma was over there, and the two, and I'd have gone to some European conferences on trauma, and there was no talk about family therapy, going to family therapy conferences and no talk about trauma. So in trying to bring those two things together, and being scared at times, setting up the family trauma centres, a lot of money, and a lot of faith put in me and people's jobs and all of that. There were things along my family therapy training that I thought, oh, that's really interesting. There's something for me in that. The Just Therapy team would have been one. That checking out which tribe you came from before you would sit down, who's connected to who. And we do that in Northern Ireland. And all the research would say that we check out somebody's name. Are you Anne? Anne with an E or A-N-N? If you're Anne with an E, you're Catholic. And we do this routinely. Where do you come from? What school did you go to? If you went to St. Malachy's, you're Catholic. If you went to state school, you're Protestant. But we did it not to be discriminatory, in a deep sense to know, need to know, perhaps for safety reasons. Who are you with? Where are they going? And if you ever sat in a hotel room with people affected by the troubles, they sit facing the door, just in case, that they know how they can get out. They'll always sit facing the doors or right beside the exit. So they're safe. So even young children, we just have this desperate need to know. But bringing the two teams together, Catholics, Protestants, men, women, there was no accounting for who would help who. You just couldn't tell. And after a while, it didn't matter so much, because there was one gentleman, he was English and he'd been in the UDR, and
that's the Ulster Defence Regiment.
Yeah, and had been very affected by the conflict. And no, he's actually from the south of Ireland, very deeply affected by the conflict. And I thought my colleague from the south of Ireland would be the perfect person to talk to him. And he said to her, "What the F do you know about it? You never even grew up here." And he was more interested in the American guy, who he felt was more trauma informed. So trying to mix and match. And actually some of the most precious moments came with a family when I was working with the Derry Outreach Clinic, which I loved working in Derry. And I was working with a male colleague, but he was also Protestant. And she said, you know, after all the Protestants did to my family, it's so lovely the two Protestants helped us get back on our feet again.
Ah, fantastic. Yes, yes.
So after a while, there was no... And you were saying about the waiting rooms, one waiting room, but the bit of the office that the secretary sat in. And you had to be on the ball, thinking, okay, I'm with a prison officer's family now, and the next person coming in at serve time. I can't have them all mixing on the stairs or meeting on the stairs. So trying to do that, just being mindful, sensitive, and sensible as you can. But also the families too kind of led the way. Some of the children, maybe, you know, if your name is Roisin, people will know what community you come from. Mm-hmm. And the children being, and the mother said, "Hey, stop. Who do you think helped you when you were in hospital?" Do you know? I'm going to pull them for their attitudes. School uniforms, we're big on school uniforms in Northern Ireland, so immediately you can tell which school kids go to, Catholic, Protestant, whatever. But in my own life, I've been very involved in integrated education. I'm a strong believer in integrated education. Mm-hmm. And all my children went to integrated schools. And now my grandchildren are at the same integrated schools. And they play camogie, and they play, which is Gaelic sports, and go to their hurling. When you were
growing up, no Protestant child would have played Gaelic sports.
No. It was an apartheid.
It was an apartheid.
We were segregated. And even more than that a lot of the areas, including the Protestant areas, were turned into cul-de-sacs. So the army could run through places quickly or not. It was a very controlled environment. When I was late teenager, if you were going out for a night in Belfast, you went out at 12 o'clock lunchtime because the city was dead by 11. And nobody kind of came here in terms of groups or those kind of things. And for safety reasons, you kind of stayed to your own kind of area, both sides. And it's only when I went to university and began to work in the health service that you met people from the other community. And found yourself in houses in West Belfast, the same era of council housing as my mother's home, but not done up to the same extent with public money. And you could see the poverty, particularly somewhere like Derry, the tiny houses, and all the history of Derry, and paying attention to those things. And when I started to work in Derry, I looked for the, community resources that would be there to help people. No Bernardo's, no NSPCC, very little. Didn't begrudge them anything. Very, very little in terms of service provision. Absolutely.
Yes. Oh, and you had a very good eye, as I said in the outset, to that kind of context. The other thing that really impressed me was that you were very sensitive to the fact that in the systemic field and family therapy, we used two-way screens, one-way screens, and that this, for a lot of families, would have unnerved them because these screens were associated with interrogations and police stations and in the prisons. And so you had a way of making them kind of friendly to the people that came in. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's a kind of
just being mindful and sensitive that two-way screens can have a very sinister meaning for families, especially anybody who's been interrogated in Castlereagh Holding Centre or some of the interrogation places that there were in Northern Ireland. So asking, is this okay? Do you want to come behind the screen and see? And the kids would come behind and wave at their mum and making sure that people felt okay about that. And if they didn't, then we would all be in the one room if they didn't feel comfortable about it, but making sure you ask, is this okay? Do you feel okay? Particularly people who had been involved in paramilitary activity or who had reason to be questioned by the police. And I wanted the door to be open to everybody, absolutely everybody. And it didn't matter what side you were on. And I think that's what I really liked about the Fifth Province. When I learned more about that, Imelda, how could I make a space for all sides of the story to be told? A very safe space, a sacred space. And I found inspiration in that. And I found a very open way in the reflecting team that we weren't behind the screen making judgments, that we would swap the rooms. And you could also, in using the reflecting team, you could say very difficult things. For a mum who perhaps had given up on cooking, who was taking a lot of medication, who was staying in her bed a lot, that perhaps the team could come from behind your screen and say, I'm really not sure how much longer this can go on. The children are struggling. They really need their mummy. They need their mummy to do mummy jobs, and say difficult kind of things. So it was open. It was honest. It was a space for all sides of the story to be told and heard. And that was really at the heart of what I was trying to do. It's unbelievable that, by the time of the peace process in 1998, there was not one single service for people psychologically affected by the Troubles. Not one.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Valium was massively overprescribed because doctors were struggling. Yeah, doctors struggling with people coming into their surgery in bits. They had nothing to offer except a prescription. And even today, we lack services, and we have a really high suicide rate here. We have a really high drug problem in Northern Ireland. But again, travelling north and south, when I was working in Dublin, I had met families with the heroin problems before. That was in Dublin. So in the north, the paramilitaries controlled, like the mafia when they controlled alcohol and bootlegged. And then it becomes profitable. And I think we'll get into that. And now we have all the fake Lyrica, fake Valium, a big amount of cocaine, all of that kind of. So we were away from a lot of that European way of dealing with things, and now the mafia. And many of the paramilitary groups are now mafia. There's no doubt about it. They made their money Yeah, they made their money through drugs now, prostitution, racketeering, money laundering, money lending, and they prey on the poor.
Mm.
No doubt about it.
I remember, I suppose I'm going to switch tack a little bit, the opening of the Family Trauma Centre. And you weren't sure right up to the last minute who was going to formally open the Family Trauma Centre. Was it Tony Blair or was it Mo Mowlam? And Mo Mowlam was the UK Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who was much loved on this island, apart from the Unionists. She was hated by the Unionists, but she was loved north and south by everybody else. And I remember there were all sorts of stories about her dealing with the awful language and discourses that were used during the peace talks. But I remember that day very well, and being in the Family Trauma Centre with everybody waiting for whoever was going to come, and the helicopters overhead. So there was still the traces when you opened of the war. And but it was Mo Mowlam who arrived. And before coming in to meet any of the people that you had gathered, there were families from the two communities in the different waiting rooms. And so she went up to meet them. They were the first people I remember her going to meet. And she was trying to entice them to come downstairs. And they were very nervous and shy and that. And I remember the story that she or you told, I can't remember which, that she pulled up her clothes and she hooshed up her knickers and her tights and she said, "Come on, follow me." And they were so gobsmacked that they all followed her downstairs. And she was renowned for that sort of thing, of taking off her wig, because she'd been through...
Her tights were falling down.
Her tights were falling down.
Yeah. Oh, but was her knickers and all were on display.
Yeah, hitched up the skirt, and she was like that she shocked, and it was almost like inducing a trance. People became so shocked that they just followed her. But I remember also that day you spoke a lot about the Family Trauma Centre as a fifth province. And I know that was controversial with some members of your team and some members professionally in Northern Ireland at the time too. But I remember she talked about then of how sorry she was that she hadn't discovered that metaphor, because she felt it would have been so useful in the talks on Northern Ireland, peace talks, I should say. And she then came and she said, you had mentioned that Cúige was the name of, it was the Irish for province, and Cúige was the fifth, so it was kind of a double fifth. And she came, and you and she and Nullig and I were standing together talking, and she said, Cúige, Cúige, the double fifth, the fifth of the fifth, Cúige, Cúige. So here was this English woman who was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, speaking in the Irish language in a way that we had never used the fifth province. Mm-hmm. And it was such a profound moment of this amazing woman, human being, giving us back that gift, as it were. And it seemed very momentous at the time. I don't know if you remember it.
Oh, I'm tearing up thinking about that day. I remember it very well. And the other thing she did in Northern Ireland was to say, hey, women need to be involved in politics. There were no women. Women's job in the DUP was to make sandwiches. That was their job. Not to be involved in proper politics or to represent the country in any way. And she really, on the ground, women's movements, she wanted them involved. And that's what she encouraged and nurtured. And one of the people who was very involved in all of that was Monica McWilliams. And she was Monica McWilliams was an inspiring teacher, and I really admired the work she did in the peace process. And it was actually Monica McWilliam who made sure that the needs of the victims were written into the Good Friday Agreement. She did that. And without her, I don't know if their needs would have been there identified, but they were. And the Family Trauma Centre came from that. But when it came to recurrent budgets, we weren't kind of listed for that. It was a whole to do and spend money and have a good political day and a good story from Moolum. But I went to her and she told me what to write and what to do. And I did that and went down like a lead balloon. And I remember being in a meeting in the Department of Health and they said, hey, you didn't write that, did you? Yeah. But we got the money. I didn't care. As long as we got the money and we kept going, I didn't care. But for the first few years, it was a fighting game. And there were people, other people in other trusts in Belfast who thought, why are you opening in South Belfast? Leafy treed South Belfast. This should be in North and West. This should be in the heart of the conflict. But I disagreed in that I thought it should be in a very safe place, that it didn't matter walking down that street, what uniform you were in, who saw you. It was the university area. It was quiet. Yes, it was leafy South Belfast, but much better than the heart of the conflict. A safer kind of place to be. But there were people who didn't like it. Psychiatrists didn't like it. I was at a meeting one day and the money issue came up, and the psychiatrist who made a lot of money from writing reports for compensation. And we had a new chief executive at the time, and she was, again, female, lovely. And he said, can I just ask you, how is Arlene going to get the money for the Family Trauma Centre in the future? And she said, thank you very much for your question, Dr. So-and-so. Can I just tell you that's my problem, not yours. Any other questions? And ended the meeting. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So there were a lot of people who helped and supported in small ways they mightn't even know to make it work. And now it's going strong. They do a lot of work with refugees and asylum seekers, and still employing family therapists, not systemically led, but I would like psychology led for now. But I think that'll change.
Mm-hmm. What would you like to say to somebody going forward about working in a potentially very traumatizing area for a number of years, in a very traumatizing context, and coming out so intact, as it were? You were very profoundly affected, but you were affected in ways that allowed you to do positive things. What would you say to younger colleagues about this? Because now there's so much of a discourse, and it's more an individualized discourse on trauma. What would you say to younger systemic colleagues about that?
Get a good team about you. Get good people about you. Get good supervision. But good colleagues that you can honestly talk to about the work, preferably co-work. Don't be, somebody said to me one day, you don't see Cagney without Lacey. This is a job for two people, not one person. So where you can, work with somebody else, be supported by somebody else, come out of a really difficult situation, go to the kitchen, and sometimes have a laugh. It was a lovely, lovely team to work with, and I loved them dearly. And we would still meet up, and the closeness was there. But often people would say, what's going on in your kitchen? I could hear all the laughing. And it was a couple of times we went to European conferences, and quite a few people wanted to come and sit at our table because all the laughing and joking that was going on. And kind of Irish people are well known for that, and taking the piss out of themselves as well. So wonderful people, close people, but also you can have a laugh with. Mm-hmm. Don't be on your own. It's really important that don't be on your own.
Of building community around yourself.
Yeah, don't be on your own ever. It's too hard.
I just wanted to say something about that. I mean, it's so important that we can miss it, but we're living in a context that's highly individualizing at the moment. Mm. And it's about kind of entitlement, and that's more than just an inclusive entitlement to have one's voice heard and counted. But I think it's important to take on that that's part of a larger discourse which is in a way anti-community. And what we need is community, and particularly in these fragmenting times that we have today in our lives and in our world. And so I'm so glad you said that. I was figuring that probably was one of the biggest supports that you've had,
Absolutely.
alongside the strong women that you had at your back and that you went to support for.
And I had a very good colleague, Mary Kenny, who you know well. And we did the train journey together all those years and chit-chatted together. And then she was appointed as deputy. And then not long after we opened, I became quite ill and she kept the show on the road. She came from the south, brought a different voice into the equation, which was really important. But I was blessed to have, these were the first family therapy posts in Northern Ireland. We had the very first posts. So all the oldies out there who had done our family therapy training were great, well, be a family therapist. And from that, then the master's program took off again with Isabel Riley and Stephen Coulter more recently. And lots of good things happened with trainee social workers, trainee family therapists, and battle it. Don't accept no. Do not accept no.
That's a fantastic thing.
Find a way around it. Do not accept no. Find a way around it.
With support. But also, I wasn't scared, like, over the money to talk out loud about that, to find somebody else who could try and get the money. You need money. You need money. Yeah. Arlene, what's the thing you're most proud of? And I know that's a hard question for you. Or what's the thing that you'd like said about you? Now.
Okay. So having brought together a wonderful band of family therapists, most of whom had trained in the matter in Dublin. Nearly all of them, I think, had trained in the matter together. And bringing them all together and having a beautiful building to work in, a beautiful building that families could see when they came in, they were valued, changing the rules, like, you know, the rules were if you had 3 DNAs, you were out. No, you could come back as much as you wanted. And when you finished, if you wanted to come back, just lift the phone. And small things to change kind of the rules of the way of working, because traumatized families, you know, even if you did brilliant work when the child was age 6, you have to revisit it again on down the line. And the door should always be wide open for them to come through whenever they need it. So proud of that. Proud it's still going strong. Proud of some really good people that are working there now, and doing a lot of very difficult trauma work with people from outside Northern Ireland who've come to live here, because with the peace process came, okay, maybe Northern Ireland is an okay place to go. It's become a tourist destination, which is amazes me no end. So yeah, I'm proud of also that people being educated about what family trauma is.
Yeah.
I was a very famous traumatologist in Norway, Atle Dyrograf, and he talked about family dynamic, that it blows the family apart. And it's our job to try and put the family back together again. And that's no mean feat.
Yeah. And I think that metaphor of always having the door open is a metaphor for your life, I think, really. And my experience of you is you've always kept the door open and always kept your curiosity and, you know, your search for what works in the service of people and what can give them the best. And so thank you very much. And I also loved you mentioning Mary, because of course she was part of our little team in the Mater in Ballymun. I worked with her for many years there, and yes, she's an old friend of both of us. So thank you so much, Arlene. I'm so grateful that I get to hear your story again, and I hope that it would also be inspiring for those people who will have the privilege of listening to you on this podcast.
I hope so.
Thank you, and thank you to Murmurations for having us, and all the best with your future work.
Hope you enjoyed the conversations as much as we have. Please get in touch and let us know what you liked, what resonated for you, and who else you might like to hear more from. Please feel free to share with others in your personal and professional network. Rate this show on your platform, and let's create our Systemic Lives community.